Hi everyone, my name is Renee Thompson and I am the CEO and President of RTConnections, a company that educates, connects, and inspires current and future nurses. And I'm really excited to have Lorie Brown in this Skype video call because, many of you know that I spend the majority of my time helping individuals and organizations eliminate this whole issue of nurse bullying. Well, a lot of nurses, they end up telling me some situations that they're in that really start to cross the line into that, okay, this is a legal issue now. And I really am not the expert in helping them, but Lorie is. So I'm really excited that she's on the call and she's going to talk to us about some of the legal aspects of these types of behaviors in healthcare. So Lorie, welcome to the call, and maybe you could just tell us a little bit about your company and what you do.
Well, hey Renee, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. And basically, I'm a registered nurse as well as an attorney, and my company is called Brown Law Office, and I also have a company that I'm putting under the same umbrella called Empowered Nurses, because it's really one end of the spectrum to the other, from protection to empowerment. And I always say I want to leave nurses better off than when they came to me in the first place. So I represent nurses before the board, not just where I'm located in Indiana, but nationally as well. And I co-counsel with other attorneys, mostly nurse attorneys, as well as other attorneys who know license board matters, and some employment law attorneys as well, and help nurses throughout the country.
Well, I tell you what, it's so wonderful to know that there are someone like you and others who are out there that can really help us understand nursing from a legal perspective. As I said, nurses contact me asking for help, and I can teach them how to deal with a bully. But when they start to cross that line into, is this something that they could actually file a suit against their employer? And when they start asking me these questions, I really don't know the answer. And, like I said, thank God that you're here. So can you just tell us, let's say when nurses are in what they perceive to be a bullying situation, and they've already filed a complaint and maybe even are retaliated against. And I know a lot of nurses, they can end up losing their job because they're speaking out. Can you tell us, maybe help us understand what options they may have?
Well, I have to say that employment law is probably the most difficult area to practice. Most states have what's called employment at will laws, which means that an employee can be fired for whatever reason. With the caveat that the facility has to follow its policies and procedures. If you're a state employee or a federal employer, you may have a little bit better protection, or union employee, but for the most part, most of us in regular hospitals or healthcare institutions, it's employment at will, and there is really very little protection. The only protection you have is to make sure that they follow their policies and procedures. So you could have a claim, though, for discrimination or a hostile work environment, retaliatory discharge, but I'm here to tell you that if you can stay out of the courtroom, you are so much better off. It is so much easier to resolve these problems amicably and create win-wins rather than
Sure.
look to the law, the courtroom for relief.
Sure. Some nurses will say, they'll give me a situation, maybe they were terminated. And, Lorie, when a nurse shares his or her experience with me, and if it's an experience where they actually are terminated and then they claim that they were bullied out of a job, I have no choice but to believe that, knowing that sometimes there's this whole other story behind it.
Right.
And many times a nurse will say, can I sue my employer for being terminated? And I guess I hear what you're saying is, that shouldn't be the first thing that you try to do.
Exactly.
Is to go down that legal pathway.
Exactly.
But if a nurse believes he or she is being targeted, for bullying and is concerned that they may lose, their jobs, can you help the listener to just know what are some steps that they can do to protect themselves, knowing that the hospital can terminate them at will?
Yeah. The first step is to know your hospital's policy and procedure and know what they require in terms of what do they define as bullying, what kind of behaviors, what are they going to do about it. and know what that policy and procedure is. And the second is, and I know you touch on it all the time, is document, document, document. And I know you're sick of documenting because you're documenting all day on your patients, but this is the most important. It really is. This is to protect yourself. So I also think you need to make a decision and look in your heart. Is this a place where you want to work?
Yeah.
And that's, if you smell the handwriting on the wall, do you really want to stay there? Do you want to stay where you're being treated like that? And what I offer people is a service called Graceful Exit. So it helps you, yeah, my new coined term, that we help people amicably leave their employment with a neutral reference, no reporting to the board. They won't contest unemployment, things like that, that at least the person can feel empowered walking away from that job.
That's a wonderful, I think, solution. I don't know that that's the best word, but when nurses find themselves in these situations, I love that, graceful exit. So this is something that you work with the nurse and the employer.
Right. Right.
So that, okay, I'm not going to report you to the board. Okay, I'm not going to, file a suit against you or whatever. But, I really like that you said about, do you really want to stay in an organization that's hostile, that is toxic, that is going to even be okay with treating their employees that way? But I know, Lorie, you know that there are some nurses that they've been in that organization for 35 years, or maybe it's the only hospital in their area. They're out in rural, part of the country and don't have a whole lot of options. And, that can be a hard thing, but I really like, how you spin it. It's just not healthy for you to even stay in that organization.
Yeah, and I also am very famous for saying you can always get another job. You can't always get another license. So if you feel that your license is on the line, don't stay. Your license is too important. You work too hard to get it.
How do you respond to nurses who say, well, if I leave, then the bullies win?
That's a tough one, too. That's really tough. But who's really winning?
Exactly. That's what I try to. It's just like cutting off your nose to spite your face.
Exactly.
Let them win if you're going to protect, like you said, your license. Because I always talk about their health, their physical, mental, spiritual, psychological health. But I like how you add, oh no, you got to protect your license.
It's your livelihood.
Yes, exactly. Some nurses will ask me the difference between like bullying and, say, harassment. And Lorie, I really don't know that I have a clear understanding of that. Could you talk about what constitutes harassment?
I'm not sure that there's a fine line between it. But harassment, if they're creating a hostile work environment for you, that is a legal basis of a claim. And I think you talk a lot about where bullying comes from. They don't know any better and they don't take responsibility for it. And harassment, maybe they do. But I think maybe bullying is a type of harassment.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's how I would define it.
Okay. And, do you think a lot of organizations have policies about harassment, or are they sort of lumped into one, just in general behavior?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think every hospital is unique and different, and they have their own sets of guidelines. But don't just look for a specific policy on that. Look for policies in terms of what their discipline process is.
I see. Because, I always remind people that you have policies, and you should become familiar with your policies. And it's amazing to me, and I'm sure you see it too, that there are some nurses that rarely ever look at policies beyond the clinical, sort of tasks that they do. How to check placement of an NG tube, and you've got a policy for that. But to look at it beyond the clinical skills that you have to perform, but look at it from an organizational perspective. And I like that approach, looking at it from a how do we discipline our employees? Now, if a nurse believes that the policy, let's just say the nurse gets retaliated against and feels that she's being a target now, and she looks at the policy and she sees that the organization or her manager maybe isn't following the policy, what can she do then?
You can go up the chain of command. If your manager is not supportive of you, go to her manager or go to HR or go to somebody else. Sometimes if you believe that patient safety is involved, a great person to go to who has been wonderful in these kind of situations is risk management, because that's their job. Or if there's a patient advocate too, that's another place to go. Because if patients are at risk because of this kind of behavior, then people need to know.
Yeah, no, I think that's great, because that's not something that I think many nurses think about. Mm-hmm. They think about their manager, they think about human resources, but they don't think about risk management. And I did a little bit of risk management in a role that I had years ago. Pretty much everything that happens in that organization that could be potentially negative, either from a clinical perspective or from an employee perspective, ends up in risk management.
Yeah.
They play some role in it. But I think that's another resource for nurses, especially if they feel that, it's either, as you said, a hostile work environment, and in some way it leads to patient safety issues, which I think is important.
Yeah, hospitals are very worried about having bad press or having suits against them. So the risk manager is the best person to go to for those type of things.
Okay. No, I think that's good. I know you speak to a lot of nursing students.
I do.
Is there any advice, because a lot of my audience are those nurses graduating from nursing school and entering into their first professional role. They're my favorite group of people. Mm-hmm. Can you give them advice starting out early in their career on how to be mindful of sort of all the legal aspects of nursing? And we've been talking about bullying, but even from the perspective of protecting their license. So what are some of the big ticket items where they can start very early on making sure that they're protecting themselves?
Yeah. Definitely know your policies and procedures, and know the Nurse Practice Act in your state, and know what's within your scope of practice. And I have a system called GIFTS, and GIFTS is an acronym for a program that I have, which is, if you use your GIFTS, you're going to be able to protect your license, speak your mind, stand in your power, and be a change agent to improve patient care. And if one of those gifts is missing, it could lead to trouble. So the gifts stand for, the letter G is for the word giving. And giving is, not only do you have to be giving to yourself, which is huge because most nurses don't give to themselves.
Yes.
We give to our patients unconditionally. We're there for them. We work these crazy hours. We work overtime multiple days in a row because they're short-staffed or whatever the situation is. Patients aren't that the issue, but we have to give to each other. And if we're giving, and in an environment which is giving, where we have each other's back and support each other, it will resolve a lot of these bullying issues.
Yeah.
The second is integrity. Integrity is not just telling the truth, but you do need to be truthful on employment applications, your license renewal, and as well as your documentation. But do what's in line with you and what's in line with your core values. So if you're not speaking up when you're being harassed and you have a core value to treat each other with respect, there's a disconnect there. Mm-hmm. And that's a problem, and it's going to lead to problems with your license as well. The F is for the word focus and follow through, and obviously as a nurse, that's such a huge area. We get distracted and called in 20 million places at the same time, but just focus on what you're doing and be present in the moment and not be thinking about that nurse who bullied you earlier or your family situation or anything like that. Just focus on what's going on in that moment, and that will help you give the best patient care.
Yeah, that's so important.
And then the T is for trusting your gut. And we always talk ourselves out of it. You walk into a patient's room, the patient looks you know something's wrong. You take his vitals, everything's fine, but something's wrong. You can't put your finger on it. And you're like, if I call the doctor now, he's just going to yell at me. But your gut is telling you that for a reason.
Yeah.
And you pay attention. It will save you every time. Also trusting your gut about your employment situation. If your gut is saying, leave, get out of here, I don't belong here, listen to that gut. Don't be like, oh, how am I going to find another job? How am I going to feed my family? Every nurse that I've ever had who has had an employment situation and has left is so much better off for it.
Oh, yes.
And they all write me. And I just got a picture of one of my clients thanking me again. She's in her wedding gown and says, my life is so much better. I couldn't imagine that it could get, that I thought she was on the verge of suicide because of the license matter. It was horrible. It just broke my heart. And to see her now just in her beautiful wedding gown, all happy, and she found a much better place to work, and the license matters are behind her, and it does get better. It doesn't feel like it at the time, but it does. And so trust your gut. It's telling you something for a reason. And then the last one is source. You are the source of what happens in your life and your career. And if you choose to stay where you are, then you're choosing the consequences. And if you're choosing to put up with bullying, you're the one who suffers the consequences. So you're at choice in every situation. You're at choice. You were saying how nurses come to you and say, well, I'm in a rural area. There aren't any hospitals nearby. But you choose where you live.
Yeah.
You've got a license to practice in the entire state, and if you have a compact license in several states. So the choice is yours. And when you feel like you have choices, you have freedom, you have control. So
yeah, and I think that's a good point, Lorie. I think sometimes nurses don't realize that they have choices, that they have options. I was just talking to a colleague yesterday about a situation, and I said to her, what are your options? And, she couldn't really think about them. And we just engaged in conversation. And by the time we were done, she had 3 or 4 options. Most of them, she hadn't even realized they were options for her.
Yeah. You might not like the options, but they're there.
Yeah. They can come and talk to you about this, that you can help them to actually discover, no, you have other options.
Yeah. And you might not like the options, but they're still there. They're still there. And by choosing what you want, it gives you power, and there's freedom in it.
Oh, absolutely. And, when I talk to nurses about speaking up or filing a complaint against a, bullying situation, and many of them don't want to because they fear retaliation. And, I say, and retaliation is alive and well, and it happens.
It does.
And then, before they actually then file a complaint or speak up, actually tell them, prepare for retaliation.
Yeah.
Meaning, take a look at your other options. And some of those other options are employment other options.
Exactly.
Because if you get into the situation where the retaliation is profound, you want to know ahead of time what your options are to leave that organization or leave that unit or something like that. So, no, I love the acronym GIFTS, and I think nurses undermine the importance of all of these, integrity and focus, because we get so overwhelmed. I think it's a nice grounding acronym for them.
Thank you. Yeah, I get situations all the time where, well, my supervisor told me to do it. Well, where's the order? There's no order. And you're in a box because you have a direct order from a supervisor, yet you know that you're not protected. So what do? You've got to speak up. And documentation is the best way to protect yourself. So if you're asked to do something that you don't feel comfortable with, write it down. Keep track of it. Then you at least have evidence and who you gave it to.
Lorie, when people come to you for help, is it mostly nurse to nurse, or is it more, say, employer to nurse, or do you get a lot of people asking you for help to deal with a physician to nurse issue? Can you tell us about some of the situations that you find most common?
It's mostly employment situations, and if you leave on a bad note, and patient care is involved, or documentation issues, you'll get reported to the licensing board. You may or may not, I can't say that, but a lot of times I'm like, they reported you for that, and then my client usually doesn't have the documentation to support it, and they do. So what do? So document and keep notes to yourself. If you're given an assignment that you think is not safe because you're way short-staffed, write a note to your supervisor, keep a copy of it, and then at least you have some protection.
Sure. You mentioned something that reminded me of a few nurses who reached out to me who were, they believe, wrongfully terminated. They had no documentation, so there was really little that they could do. And then when they tried to get a job in that same city, in that same area, they believed they were being blackballed by that organization who wrote, would not rehire. They were afraid that, say, a prospective employer would call the previous employer and that previous employee would trash that employee. I always thought that if somebody calls a previous employer and asks for, some type of reference, that employer is not allowed to actually discuss the performance of that employee, only that they work there. Is that true?
That is true. That is true. They're only supposed to give dates of hire and dates when they left, what their position was, and if they left voluntarily or they were terminated. And that's it. Okay. But the problem is we don't know what they say.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, and if you get proof that somebody is saying something negative about you, great, we could do something about it. But how do you get that proof?
Yeah,
you just
kind
don't.
Of a he said, she said kind of a thing.
Right. Or what if you called me, Renee, and said, I'm calling about Jean. Did she work for you? Oh, yeah. Well, when did she work for you? Gosh, from January to May. Well, what can you tell me about her? Oh, I can't tell you anything. The voice says it all. You know that yeah.
Yeah. So do you think do you really think that happens, that some of these nurses are being blackballed? Do you really think, or do you think that in general is just something that they perceive because they're in this sort of stressful state?
I think that all the calls go through human relations. Mm-hmm. And how does that person, unless they were involved in your termination or your resignation, they don't really know you from Adam, so they really aren't going to say anything. But one thing that you can do, which I recommend to everybody, and I'm surprised how few people actually do it, keep a copy of all your performance evaluations.
Yes, that's a good point.
Because if you are going for another job and you say, well, sure, call them, but here's a copy of my most recent employment evaluation. I don't care what they say on the phone. They can't dispute what's in writing right in front of them.
I think that is a perfect example of an action that nurses can take starting now, even if they've got a great relationship with their manager and their employer. And, and I hadn't done that when I was a new nurse. But then as I changed roles, I just started keeping them just because I like and this was before everything was electronic. Uh-huh. Because some of the things, it was kind of like they said nice things about me and I wanted to keep that.
Yeah.
And so I started keeping them all. And then, as I got into doing more speaking and teaching, I started to realize that that's a valuable tool that you can use for evidence of good performance when somebody all of a sudden accuses you of poor performance. Mm-hmm. Unless something dramatic happened, where you had a psychological breakdown, past performance predicts future performance. So I think that's a great action step to even start when you're a brand new nurse.
Yeah, and print it out. Don't keep it on your work email, because if you're not there anymore, that's what a lot of people say. Well, it was in my email, but it doesn't help you.
I think that's a great piece of advice. Yeah, print it out and keep it in your folder at home.
Yeah, and I always suggest have a folder, and any discipline that you've had, any write-ups, anything that could possibly result in a board matter, put it in that folder and just have it. This is your rainy day protection file. So if anything happens, this is your umbrella, your insurance that will help you.
Well, that's great advice, because the next time a nurse says to me, "Oh, I think I'm being blackballed," probably what I'll ask is, "Do you have any performance evaluations that you can use when?" Because some nurses will say, "I'm afraid to go on an interview. Do I tell them what happened at this other organization? Do I tell them I was bullied out of a job?" And that's always difficult for me to answer. And I don't know, Lorie. If a nurse asks you that question, how much should a nurse tell the next prospective employer about what happened at the previous?
Well, I believe honesty is always the best policy. But when you say I was bullied, you're at effect to somebody else.
Yeah.
So what can you say that is empowering about yourself and the situation that would look most favorable to you? And really the best answer that I always recommend is it just wasn't a good fit.
Yeah, wasn't a good fit for me.
And nobody can argue against that, because everybody knows in nursing there's a million types of places, a million environments, and, some might not fit better than the other.
Yeah, and sometimes I try to remind nurses that even though it doesn't feel this way now, you're going to find another position and you're going to realize that this was a gift.
Yes.
To enable you to leave a toxic work environment. And, the hope is that they find a better place, that they find an organization who actually values the employees, that the employees value each other and support and nurture each other. So,
right.
So maybe, can you tell us a little bit about if nurses wanted to find you, to learn more about you? Can you tell us a little bit about the book that you've written for nurses? I think that'd be very helpful.
Sure. The book that I wrote is called Law and Order for Nurses, The Easy Way to Protect Your License and Your Livelihood. And it's available on Amazon or lawandorderfornurses.com. And then my law practice site is right now currently brownlaw1.com. And I got so tired of saying Brown Law 1 that I'm changing it hopefully any day now to yournurseattorney.com. So if you go to yournurseattorney.com, you will be able to find me. I have a free audio CD on my website, What Happens If You Get Called Before the Board. So learn about it, hear about it, because it does happen. Every nurse that has ever come to me has said, I never thought I'd be before the board. And that's why I wrote my book and about the gifts, to show people how you can protect themselves, how they can protect themselves. So it doesn't happen to them. Because 7,000 nurses a year are disciplined in the United States. 7,000, yeah. And in my state alone, there were 500 last year, I believe. So, I mean, that's huge. It's a huge number. And the scary thing is it can be you. And even if you don't, for just forgetting something, just anything can escape your mind. Anybody can report you, a spouse, a family member, I mean, ex-husband. I haven't had an ex-wife yet. Ex-husbands, I had a couple of those. Your supervisor, coworker, you name it. And you got to protect yourself. I don't want you to live in fear, but a little knowledge will help. And
yeah, I think you're right. Knowledge is power.
Yeah. And then on my website as well, there's a bunch of, under resources, the tab resources, there's blogs, there's videos, there's all kinds of, there's articles I've wrote, articles that have been written about me, that I'm quoted in, everything's on there, all for free. So just arm yourself with that knowledge.
Yeah, and Lorie, you also get invited to speak at different organizations and schools of nursing to help a larger audience learn how to protect yourself. And so if somebody wanted to bring you in as a speaker, they could just contact you through your website?
Right. And my other site is empowerednurses.org. And the Empowered Nurses is more the empowering stuff. The Brown Law, yournurseattorney.com is more license protection.
Okay.
So both of them, ton of information. But I think if nurses don't say something, my motto is, if you see something, say something. And don't put up with this, because life's too short, and you're at work most of the time. You might as well work in an environment that you love. And we can change it. We can, if we stick together and not put up with this.
I agree. And I just want to thank you for sharing your expertise with us. As I mentioned, there are so many nurses that they hit that brick wall and they don't know what they can do to protect themselves from a legal perspective and really what action steps to take. So I think those listeners who are watching and listening to this are going to leave now with a couple of tools in their toolbox. So it was great chatting with you, Lorie. Thank you so much for being here on the call, and I look forward to more stuff from you.
Thank you so much, Renee. I really appreciate it. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.